The doctor's words echoed in my mind as I left her office. "That's serious, Sarah." I could barely keep my composure as I walked down the hallway, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the sterile environment around me. I had gone in expecting routine advice, maybe something minor to explain the fatigue and discomfort I had been feeling lately. But this was something I wasn't prepared for. Patel's calm yet firm tone had sent a wave of fear through me. She was telling me I had a sexually transmitted disease, one that could have long-term consequences. I tried to focus on what she was saying, but the shock made it all blurry. I heard the words treatment, test results, and long-term health issues, but none of it seemed to matter. All I could think about was the reality of what this meant. As I stepped outside, the bright sunlight seemed too harsh. It felt like everything around me was too loud, too bright, too real. The world seemed to be moving in slow motion as I struggled to process the news. I didn't even remember getting into the car, but somehow, I was sitting there gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The drive home was a blur, my mind consumed with a million thoughts, all fighting for my attention. I couldn't stop thinking about Mark. It wasn't just the affair that haunted me now. It was the weight of the disease, the guilt, the fear of losing everything I had ever cared about. I had allowed myself to get caught up in something reckless, and now I was paying the price. I had betrayed Jack, and in doing so, I had condemned myself to a life full of uncertainty. The moment I walked into the house, I was greeted by the quiet. Jack was sitting on the couch, his eyes glued to the TV. He barely looked up when I entered, too absorbed in whatever was playing. Normally, I'd welcome the peace, but today it felt suffocating. His indifference felt like a betrayal in itself, but I knew it was more about him being disconnected from me than anything else. We had drifted apart over the past few months. His work had taken priority, and I had let it happen. The tension between us was always there, just beneath the surface. We hadn't fought, but we hadn't truly connected either. "How was the doctor?" Jack asked, finally looking up at me. His voice was calm, but I could see the concern in his eyes. He had always been the one to notice when something was off with me. His question felt like a lifeline, but it also terrified me. How could I tell him what had really happened? How could I explain that I had betrayed him in the worst possible way? "It was fine," I replied, my voice trembling just slightly. I hated how weak I sounded. "Just routine stuff. Nothing to worry about." Jack's gaze didn't leave me, his eyes searching for the truth behind my words. He didn't believe me. Not for a second. He knew me too well. The lie felt like a foreign thing coming from my lips, but I had to keep it together. I couldn't risk losing him, not when everything else seemed to be falling apart. "You're sure?" he pressed, standing up and walking over to me. I could see the unease in his face now, the way his brow furrowed as he studied me. He wasn't convinced. "You don't look like yourself, Sarah. You've been off for a while now. What's going on?" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Jack had always been able to read me like a book, and I could feel the walls I had spent months building crumbling. I didn't know how to respond. I couldn't tell him. I couldn't bring myself to admit the truth. Not now. Not like this. I didn't want him to look at me the way I knew he would if he found out. He would be heartbroken, furious, maybe even scared. "I'm just tired," I said, the lie falling from my lips again. "It's nothing really." Jack didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press further. He must have sensed that something was deeply wrong, but he was choosing to give me space, probably hoping that I would come to him when I was ready. But the truth was, I wasn't ready. I wasn't sure I ever would be. The fear of what would happen if I told him was too overwhelming. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket, a vibration so sharp it startled me. I pulled it out, half expecting to see another notification from work or a friend. But it was Mark. My stomach dropped. The message was short, but it carried an urgency that sent a shiver down my spine. "Are you okay?" it said. "Your condition is deteriorating faster than I expected. You need to see a doctor again as soon as possible." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I hadn't expected to hear from him today, not with everything going on. But the message confirmed everything I had been fearing. Mark had known something was wrong before I did. The disease, the symptoms, the way it was spreading, he had been following it closely, while I had been too busy pretending everything was fine. And now, as if in some cruel twist of fate, Jack was standing right beside me, his eyes on my phone, waiting for me to explain. "Who's that?" Jack asked, his voice low, almost too calm. It was as if he knew something was off, but he wasn't sure what it was yet. I panicked. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I could barely hear his voice. I quickly shoved the phone back in my pocket, but I could feel Jack's gaze on me, the weight of his scrutiny, like a physical presence. My stomach churned with nausea, and for a moment, I thought I might be sick. "It's just a colleague," I mumbled, trying to sound casual. My voice betrayed me, shaking as I spoke. Jack didn't buy it. I saw the flash of doubt in his eyes before he looked away. I couldn't keep the lie going, but I didn't know how to come clean. Not now, not with everything already hanging by a thread. Jack didn't say anything more about it. Instead, he sat back down on the couch, rubbing his temples as if he had a headache. The tension in the room was unbearable. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had done, what was happening to me, and how it would all come crashing down. The disease was the least of my worries now. The real issue was that my whole life was teetering on the edge of collapse. Jack didn't know it yet, but everything between us was about to change, and I wasn't sure I was strong enough to face the consequences. I had always known something wasn't quite right between Sarah and me, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. At first, I thought it was just the stresses of daily life, maybe the demands of my job, or the fatigue of marriage itself. But as the months passed, the subtle changes in her behavior began to gnaw at me. Little things like how she seemed distant when we spoke, how she'd look at her phone more often than at me when we were together, how she'd forget things we had planned, or show little interest in the conversations we once had. I noticed that she was becoming more absent, both physically and emotionally, and every time I tried to ask her about it, she'd just brush it off with a weak excuse. "Work's been tough," she'd say, or "I'm just tired," but there was something in her eyes, something hollow, that made me uneasy. It wasn't until I saw the first sign that I could no longer ignore what had been simmering beneath the surface. I had come home from work one evening earlier than expected. I had planned on surprising her with a quiet dinner, something to rekindle our connection, but when I walked through the door, I found her standing in the hallway, her back to me. She was holding her phone in her hand, and I caught a glimpse of her screen. The name on it made my stomach drop. Mark. My heart skipped a beat. Mark was her colleague, the one I had met a few times, but never thought much of. Now here he was. His name lit up on her phone like a beacon, and Sarah was too absorbed in whatever they were saying to notice me standing there. I didn't say anything at first. I simply stood there trying to steady my breath, trying to push away the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When Sarah finally turned around, she looked startled, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "Oh hey, you're home early," she said, her voice too light, too casual. I didn't respond right away. I just watched her, noticing how her hand gripped the phone a little too tightly, as if she didn't want me to see it. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice calmer than I felt. "Yeah, just a work thing," she replied quickly, but I could see her eyes flicker towards the phone again. I didn't ask any more questions. I knew something was off. That night, after dinner, Sarah went to bed earlier than usual, citing that she was tired from a long week. I stayed up, watching TV, but my mind was elsewhere. The image of her phone, the name Mark flashing on the screen, kept replaying in my head. I couldn't shake the thought. I knew I couldn't accuse her of anything yet. I didn't want to be the jealous husband, paranoid over nothing. But something told me I needed to know more. The next few days were torture. I watched Sarah carefully, looking for any more signs of her distance, her detachment. She wasn't as present as she used to be, even when we were together. Her laughs seemed forced, her responses to my questions more automatic than genuine. It felt like we were strangers, and that hurt more than anything. It wasn't just the physical distance. It was the emotional coldness that chilled me to my core. One afternoon, when she was in the shower, I found myself standing in front of her dresser, staring at her phone, lying on the nightstand. My heart raced. It was wrong. I knew it was, but my gut told me that if I didn't look, I'd be making a mistake. I didn't have proof. Not yet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in a lie. So, I picked up the phone. I didn't even have to unlock it. The screen lit up when I touched it, revealing the open message thread between her and Mark. My hand shook as I scrolled through the messages, my stomach twisting with each one I read. At first, It was innocent enough work-related chats, small talk, but soon it became clear. There were emojis, flirtatious comments, and then the pictures. A selfie of the two of them at a bar, standing too close, their smiles too intimate. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. I felt the ground beneath me start to slip away. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was seeing. It wasn't just a casual friendship. It was an affair. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't just being paranoid. Sarah had been having an affair with Mark for who knows how long. I put the phone down slowly, feeling like the world was crashing down around me. My hands were still trembling. I didn't know what to do next. I wanted to confront her right then and there. But a part of me wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to hear her explanations, her lies. Not yet. I needed time to think, to process the devastation. And most of all, I needed to figure out what to do about it. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had found. It was like my brain was in overdrive, replaying the messages, the pictures, the lies. Every time I saw Sarah, I couldn't help but notice how she tried to act normal, like everything was fine, and it made my anger grow. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. She had been living a double life, and I had been blind to it. I decided to observe her more closely. If she thought she could get away with this, she was mistaken. I watched how she interacted with Mark, the way she would slip away to send him a quick text when she thought I wasn't looking. I saw how her eyes lit up when her phone buzzed, how she would become distracted and distant whenever he messaged her. I began to recognize the small signs of betrayal, signs I had missed for so long. Each time she tried to act like nothing was wrong, my anger built. It wasn't just the affair, it was the complete disregard for me, for our marriage. It was the lies, the betrayal of everything we had built together. But as angry as I was, I also felt something else, something darker. A sense of powerlessness, mixed with the need to make her understand what she had done. I wasn't going to confront her yet, though. I needed to plan. I needed to find the right moment to make her see what she had done, to make her feel the weight of her actions. I kept watching, biding my time. Each day, I saw more. The longer I waited, the angrier I became. Sarah thought she could get away with it, but I was going to make sure she didn't. I started thinking of ways to make her feel the same pain, the same betrayal. I couldn't just let this slide. I needed her to know that I wasn't going to be a passive bystander in my own life. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about the lies, the deception, the way she had taken everything we built together and turned it into something cheap. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I wasn't going to sit quietly and let this happen to me. The decision to confront her wasn't made lightly, but it was coming, and when it did, it was going to be on my terms. I had always prided myself on being in control. At work, my position gave me that power over the projects, the team, and even the people. I never took it lightly, but with Sarah, something changed. When we started our affair, I didn't think it would get complicated. I was her superior, and she was an ambitious employee who wanted to climb the ladder. She was easy to manipulate, or so I thought. But as time passed, I realized that I was becoming too invested, too reliant on her. She became not just a tool for my desires, but an asset, someone I could control. But now, as the months dragged on, I began to feel the pressure building. It wasn't just the affair anymore. It was the way Sarah began pulling away. At first, it was subtle. She wasn't as quick to respond to my texts, didn't look at me the same way during our meetings. But I could tell. I could always tell when someone was hiding something, when their emotions were shifting. When I called her into my office to discuss a project, I saw the way she avoided eye contact. There was an anxious energy about her now, and I hated it. She was no longer the confident, eager woman who came to me for guidance. Instead, she seemed distant, unsure. The worst part was that she was starting to talk about Jack more often. In the beginning, she had made it clear that her husband was oblivious to everything, that he was too wrapped up in his own life to notice the cracks in their marriage. But now, she would mention him at the strangest times, always in the context of how difficult their relationship was, how he wasn't there for her anymore. The more she spoke of Jack, the more I realized that she was trying to justify our affair to herself. She needed to believe that what we were doing wasn't wrong, that her marriage was already falling apart before we ever started. But something was happening that I hadn't anticipated. Sarah was starting to get cold feet. She was no longer fully in my control, and that made me nervous. She was pulling away emotionally, and I couldn't afford to let that happen. If she started questioning our arrangement, it could all come crashing down. One day I pulled her aside into my office. It was supposed to be a routine meeting, but I could tell something was different. She seemed more fidgety than usual, more nervous. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed her notebook on the desk. I could see the discomfort in her body language. She wasn't the woman I had known just a few months ago, and that irritated me. I needed to remind her of the power I had over her. "Sarah," I began, keeping my tone calm, professional. "I've noticed a change in you. You've been distant lately. Is something wrong?" She looked at me, her eyes wide, like a deer caught in headlights. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she looked down at her hands, almost as if she were trying to gather her thoughts before responding. "I don't know, Mark," she said, her voice faltering. I feel overwhelmed. There's so much going on, and I'm not sure I can keep it all together anymore." I leaned forward, folding my arms across my chest. "I understand that you're under pressure, but you need to remember something important, Sarah," I said, my voice lowering. "Everything you have here, your job, your position, your future, it's all at risk. I've been helping you get ahead. I've been pushing you because I believe in your potential. But that comes with a cost. If you can't keep up with that, then maybe we need to rethink things." Her eyes flickered with fear. I saw it, that moment of realization. She knew exactly what I meant. If she stepped out of line, if she crossed me, I could destroy everything she had worked for. I could end her career. I had the power to do it, and I wasn't afraid to use it. She hesitated again, her breath quickening. "I didn't mean to." I cut her off. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself. I'm telling you that you need to get back on track. Don't start letting personal things get in the way. You made a choice when you decided to get involved with me. Now you need to follow through." She nodded, but I could tell it wasn't out of agreement. It was out of fear. And that was exactly what I wanted. I needed her to be afraid of me, afraid of losing everything. I needed her to know that the consequences of stepping out of line were far worse than anything she could imagine. But as the days went on, I started to see more cracks in her facade. I noticed how she would flinch when her phone buzzed, how she would go quiet when I walked into a room. And one afternoon, I overheard her speaking to one of her coworkers in the hallway. She wasn't aware I was there, but I heard enough to make my blood run cold. She was talking about her health, how she'd been feeling unwell for a while, how things were deteriorating faster than expected. She didn't go into specifics, but I knew enough to understand that she was hiding something from me. That's when it hit me. Sarah was a loose cannon. She had the power to bring everything crashing down. If she decided to go public with our affair, if she decided to talk to Jack or anyone else about it, I could lose everything. I couldn't let that happen. I needed to remind her of her place. I needed to make sure she understood that any attempt to expose us would be disastrous for her. So I called her back into my office for another private meeting. This time I had to be more direct. I had to make it clear that there was no way out. When she entered, her face was pale, her expression strained. I could tell she was trying to keep it together, but I wasn't fooled. She was on the edge. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the chair in front of me. She obeyed, her hands clutching the arms of the chair. I stared at her for a long moment, making her squirm under my gaze. "Sarah, I think we need to have a serious talk. You've been distant lately, and I need to know what's going on. You know how much I've done for you. You know that if this gets out, you'll lose everything. Your career, your reputation, it'll all be gone." She swallowed hard, but didn't answer immediately. I could see the fear in her eyes, and it made me feel powerful, but I wasn't done yet. "You're not going to tell Jack, are you?" I asked, my voice dripping with a calm menace. "You're not going to ruin this for yourself, are you?" She looked away, avoiding my gaze. "I don't know what to do, Mark. I'm scared," she whispered. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. It's too much." I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't have a choice, Sarah. If you even think about telling him, if you even think about telling anyone about us, I will ruin you. You won't be able to recover from it. Do you understand?" Her eyes filled with tears, But she nodded slowly, resigned. She knew that I had her trapped. She knew that without me, she was nothing. And that was exactly how I wanted it. I understand, she said, her voice barely audible. I watched her leave my office, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She had been broken, and I had done it. I had made her fear me enough to keep quiet. But deep down, I knew that I couldn't let my guard down. Not now, not ever. Because if she ever decided to expose what we had done, it wouldn't just be her career at risk, it would be mine too. And I wasn't about to let that happen. The realization that my health was deteriorating hit me like a freight train, but it wasn't the physical pain that scared me the most. It was the mounting fear that everything I had built, my life, my marriage, my image, was falling apart, piece by piece. I had never felt so trapped, so helpless. The burning sensation, the nausea, the constant feeling of exhaustion had started as small, barely noticeable signs. I had hoped it was just stress, something I could shake off. But as the days went on, the symptoms worsened. It wasn't just discomfort anymore, it was pain, and it was real. The first time I really started to feel the weight of it was one morning when I tried to get out of bed. My legs were weak, and my stomach churned in a way I couldn't ignore. I rushed to the bathroom, clutching my stomach, and as I sat there, I couldn't help but wonder how I had gotten to this point. The answer was undeniable. It was the affair. It had started out so innocently, or so I told myself, a harmless flirtation at work. With Mark, someone who seemed to understand me in ways Jack no longer did. But it had escalated, and now I was paying the price. At first, the idea of going to the doctor was unimaginable. How could I explain what had happened? How could I admit that I had let myself fall into something so reckless, so dangerous? But as the pain became unbearable, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The doctor's office was cold and sterile, and the nurse who took my blood pressure barely made eye contact. I had no idea how I was supposed to be feeling, whether I was supposed to act like everything was fine, or if I could show even a fraction of the fear I was holding inside. When the test results came back, the doctor was calm, detached even. He told me what I already knew. Deep down, I had contracted a sexually transmitted disease, a consequence of my own actions. But it wasn't just the diagnosis that crushed me. It was the knowledge that I had brought this disease into my marriage. I had passed it on to Jack. The thought of telling him was unbearable. I couldn't even fathom how I would begin to explain what had happened. It was a burden I carried in silence, every day getting worse as I watched Jack become more withdrawn. I tried to act like everything was normal, but I could see the changes in him. His smile was forced, his eyes distant. He didn't look at me the same way anymore, and I didn't know how to fix it. The lies were piling up, and I was running out of ways to keep them in check. It wasn't just my own health I had to worry about. Jack had started to show symptoms of the same illness. The subtle changes, at first a slight irritability, a frown here and there, until one night, he came home from work, his face pale. "Sarah, I don't feel well," he said, his voice thin with concern. "Something's wrong. I've been feeling off all day." His admission made my heart stop. I had been holding my breath for this moment, knowing it was inevitable, but I wasn't prepared for the fear that flooded me when he spoke those words. I knew exactly what he was feeling, because I had felt it myself. But how could I tell him? How could I explain that the person he trusted the most was the one who had given him this illness? I tried to hide my panic, tried to act like everything was normal, but it was impossible. Every time he went to the bathroom, I found myself holding my breath, waiting for the inevitable. He went to the doctor a few days later, and when he came back, I could tell something was wrong. His expression was tight, his lips pressed into a thin line. I knew the answer before he even said it. "They diagnosed me with the same thing you have," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did this happen, Sarah? How did we both get this?" The truth was a jagged pill that I had to swallow, and I could feel the bitterness of it as it burned in my throat. The guilt that I had been carrying now turned to a deep, crushing shame. I had no answers for him. I couldn't explain how I had let everything spiral so far out of control. He was looking at me, waiting for me to tell him something, anything. But I was paralyzed by my own fear, by the realization that everything I had been trying to protect was now at risk. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every beat a reminder of the lies I had told. Jack's anger didn't come right away. Instead, it was the silence that killed me. The way he would look at me like he was trying to figure out what to do with the pieces of our shattered life. He didn't yell, didn't accuse me outright, but I could see the question in his eyes. How long have you been lying to me? The days that followed were a blur. Jack became more distant, withdrawing into himself, and I couldn't blame him. I was the one who had betrayed him. I had taken everything we had built and torn it apart for a fleeting moment of escape. Mark had never been an answer. He had only been a temporary distraction, a way for me to feel seen, wanted, in a way Jack no longer did. But now it was all crashing down. The next few days were filled with tension and silence. Jack didn't bring it up again, but the weight of it was suffocating. I could tell he was still processing it, still trying to make sense of what had happened. And I was left with my own guilt, my own regret, knowing that I had caused this rift in our marriage. I couldn't help but wonder if there was any way to fix it. Could we move past this? Could Jack forgive me? And how would I ever forgive myself? The thought of living with this secret, with this disease, was unbearable. It was taking its toll on me physically and emotionally, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. The moments when we would sit together in silence were the hardest. I could feel the distance between us growing with each passing day. Jack was hurting, and I had no idea how to make it better. But the truth was, I had already ruined everything. The disease was just the beginning. The real damage had already been done, and now I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I had destroyed. The evening had started like any other family gathering, but it quickly spiraled into something far darker. I could feel the tension in the room, in the way Jack's eyes kept darting toward me. He wasn't the man I knew anymore. It had been days, maybe weeks, since things had felt normal. He had grown distant, colder, as if there was something between us, a gap that neither of us could cross anymore. I kept telling myself that maybe it was just a phase, but deep down, I knew the truth was eating away at me. We were at my sister's house, sitting around a table with our closest family and friends. The hum of laughter, the clinking of glasses, it should have been comforting. But all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears, the suffocating silence between Jack and me. I knew he was suspecting something, though he had never said a word directly, but there were signs. The way he would look at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, the quiet withdrawal when I spoke, it all pointed to the fact that he knew something had shifted. I had betrayed him. My mind kept returning to the affair with Mark. I thought about how it had started innocently enough, just a few flirtations here and there, some lingering touches during work meetings, but over time it became more. The way Mark would look at me with those eyes that made me feel like I was the only woman in the room. He made me feel alive in a way Jack hadn't in years, but I never thought it would come to this, never imagined it would destroy everything. I noticed Jack's sudden shift in posture across the room. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor, the noise slicing through the quiet hum of conversation. Every pair of eyes turned toward him. My heart skipped a beat. It was like a switch had flipped, and I immediately knew something was about to happen. I need to say something. Jack's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. My throat tightened. He wasn't angry, not yet, but I could feel it building inside of him, the storm that had been brewing for so long.
It was about to break, and I was the reason.
His eyes found mine, and for the first time in days, they held no warmth. They were full of accusation, betrayal, and something else I couldn't place. I wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. There was no excuse, no way to make this right. I know about you and Mark, Jack said, the words falling from his lips like bricks. My heart stopped. I froze, my blood running cold. How could he know? How long had he known? My mind scrambled for answers, for any way to salvage this. But nothing came. The room was silent. Everyone was watching, waiting for what would come next. Jack's voice trembled, but the anger was undeniable. I've seen the way you've been acting, the secretive behavior, the late nights at work. Mlitabi. It all makes sense now. I could feel the weight of every eye on me. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. Jack had just exposed everything. The affair, the lies, the guilt that had been gnawing at me for so long, it was all out in the open. Before I could even respond, the door to the living room opened, and Mark walked in, His presence seemed to freeze the room in place. His face was unreadable, but I could see the way he looked around, gauging the tension in the air. He knew exactly what was happening. And then, in the most unexpected moment, Mark spoke. "I guess it's time to come clean," Mark said, his voice unexpectedly calm, but the edge in it was unmistakable. "I'm not just a bystander in all of this. I've played my part." I felt the ground beneath me shift. Mark was admitting it, in front of everyone. My chest tightened. I had never expected him to actually come forward like this, to expose himself in front of so many people, but there he was, standing in front of Jack, confessing his role in the affair. The weight of his words felt like a crushing blow. My mind raced. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. This wasn't the plan. I had thought I could handle this on my own, that I could keep everything hidden. But now, everything was falling apart. In the silence that followed, I could hear the whispers, the murmurs from the others around the room. The truth had shattered the illusion, and there was no going back. Jack's eyes flicked from Mark to me, and then the anger in his face deepened. "So, you both think this is some kind of joke?" Jack's voice rose, his hands shaking at his sides. "I trusted you, Sarah. I trusted you more than anyone else. And you." He turned to Mark, his fury now aimed at him. "You're supposed to be my friend." I felt sick. I wanted to say something to make it stop, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't defend myself. How could I? There was no excuse for what I had done, for the betrayal I had caused. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I felt like a stranger to myself. How had I let it go this far? I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I never wanted to hurt you. But Jack wasn't listening. His face was set in stone, the hurt and anger radiating off him. He shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "You don't get to say sorry," he spat. "You've destroyed everything we had. You've destroyed me." I could feel my own heart breaking at his words, the pain that radiated from him, the weight of what I had done. The guilt was unbearable. I couldn't look at him anymore, couldn't face the destruction I had caused. And then, in a moment of finality, Jack turned and began walking toward the door. My chest tightened as the words he spoke next hit me like a freight train. "I'm done, Sarah," he said, his voice steady, but full of resolve. "I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving." I couldn't breathe. He was leaving. Everything I had taken for granted, the love, the trust was gone. Mark stood there, looking just as stunned as I felt, but there was something in his eyes too. His facade was crumbling, the power he had once wielded over me slipping through his fingers. His role in all of this, his manipulation had just been exposed, and I could see the fear creeping into his eyes. As Jack walked out of the door, I felt like I had just lost everything. My marriage, my reputation, my life. And Mark, he was left with nothing too. The affair, the lies, the manipulation, it was all over. We were all ruined. The truth had come out, and there was no turning back. The final explosion had taken place, and there was nothing left but the aftermath. The affair, the lies, the manipulation, it was all over. We were all ruined. The truth had come out, and there was no turning back. The final explosion had taken place, and there was nothing left but the aftermath.